Hi, my name is Latrinda Knighton, and I would like to welcome you to Youth Plan for Small Group. Now what? Effective planning for small group instruction for elementary teachers. So before we get started with this presentation, let's take care of a couple of logistics. I know that this is a pre-recorded session, and so one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to provide you with some ideas for viewing this presentation if you're actually viewing it as a group with your entire faculty or with all the math teachers, or maybe as a grade level or part of vertical planning. Initially, this presentation has always been presented as a live session, and so it was planned for that. So I wanted to keep some of those components in there. And so what you'll find that we'll do is we'll pause at different places, and I'll give you some ideas where you might pause the recording so that you can engage in some discussion with your peers, or you can actually engage in some of the activity portions that are included for your enjoyment. So let's take care of a couple of kind of housekeeping things before we start today's presentation. One of the things you'll notice on the screen, there's a QR code as well as a bit.ly. And so let's go to that bit.ly and let's go to this document that's linked here. And so what you're going to find are a lot of resources here that you can use to help support you and your students around this topic. So one of the things that you'll also see, there's an elementary planning for small group Google Doc. And so we'll reference that a little bit later towards the end of our session. And this is a document that you can use for planning for small group in your classroom, but also there's a component where there's a opportunity where you can reach out and say, I want some additional help, some additional support, and ideas around implementing these things in my classroom. So this is a place where if you choose, you can leave your name and email address so that we can get back to you and provide you with some additional support. One of the other resources we'll talk about a little bit later is the independent work plan, which is a plan for you to phase in small groups of your class in your classroom if this is new to you. Because sometimes you want to know what a station activity could possibly look like. You have two resources for some sample station activities, and then there's some sample plans. One of the things we'll talk about is different types of small group interventions. So you have some sample plans to see what those could look like. So this is a document that hopefully has a lot of resources that you will find very useful for you and your students. So now that we've taken care of the housekeeping, let's go ahead and get started with today's session. So what are we going to do? In this session, we're going to identify strategies for implementing focused, differentiated small group instruction. We will examine standards-based resources for creating small group activities for independent work. So we want to find out what are those things we can use for our students when they're working independently, as well as when they're working with the teacher-led groups. Our agenda for today is very simple. We'll start with how do I make time for small group instruction? We'll move into looking at types of interventions, identifying those students, what's the best intervention for which student, and planning for those independent workstations. So those are the things that we will cover during today's session. So one of the first things we want to talk about is how do you make time for small group instruction? So in our elementary classrooms, there are two choices for the amount of minutes in the math block. Grades K2 have a 75-minute block for math instruction, and grades 3 through 5 should have a 90-minute block for math instruction. Those block requirements were put in place for master scheduling to make sure that you have time to actually do that full rotation, having your standards align, tier 1 instruction using that tier 1 resource, and then having that time for responding to your students' needs for interventions. I know that some people are operating off the old schedules that we had in the past, the 60-minute block. So what you'll see here are things that fit with the 75-minute and a 90-minute block. However, What we suggest is using flex days and assessment days if you have that shorter 60-minute block to bring in some opportunities for your students to engage in small group activities. So now let's kind of stretch our minds and let's look at a scenario. So I know that our grade 4 teachers right now are in the process of wrapping up Module 5. So let's pretend we're all fourth grade teachers and we're at the beginning of Module 5. And so in Lesson 1, the two standards that you see listed here are standards that are aligned to two of the fluency activities that are suggested for that lesson. So as you can see, this is a grade 4 classroom, but these are third grade standards, as they often are for some of the fluency activities. So one of the fluency activities is for students to read tape diagrams. So here you see the description of this activity on the screen. Students are asked to identify the value of the whole, then they write the value of one unit as a division problem and write the whole as a repeated addition sentence. Remember, in the fluency activities, your students are using their whiteboards. So it's a rapid exchange as you're asking those questions. So this would be an example if we use 15 as the whole. And so students would write that division problem, and then they would write the whole as a repeated addition sentence. This is what you would see if students were to answer that correctly. So now let's look at one of the other fluency activities from that lesson. It's addition of fractions in unit form. So students are presented, here we have some circles. They have to identify how many they see, how many equal parts are in the circle, identify the fraction of the circle that is shaded, write an addition number sentence to describe the parts of the circle, and to encourage and spark discourse among students, I added the turn and talk component to this fluency activity. So if we were to take just one of those and look at it, this is what you would see on your rapid whiteboard as your students are responding to those 4 questions. So keeping this in mind, that these are those opening activities that you're starting out with in this 4th grade lesson in Module 5, we're a little bit over halfway into the year. I want you to think about, are there any students that you think might have any difficulties, possibly, with one or more of those concepts? So if you are viewing this with a team right now, this is where I would suggest that you pause this recording and set a timer for about 7 minutes. Discuss with your partner, then discuss with the group any difficulties you anticipate some students may have with one or more of these concepts. So for those of you who are just watching all the way through, you may ask, what would be some things we would discuss at this time? Well, first of all, we know that not every child who comes to 4th grade has a stamp on his or her head that says, I'm here in 4th grade. I know all the concepts that I need to know to be ready for on grade level content in every single thing that we do. Doesn't mean that the students are behind. It doesn't mean that they're on track to not perform on grade level. Just means that they may not be ready for the content of every single topic that they get. So as teachers, this is that anticipation piece that we do. So that's looking at the upcoming module, looking at the upcoming lessons, or looking at it by topic and seeing what are those big ideas that we're covering. I'm going to start by anticipating, what if some of my students don't get it? What if some of my students is a little bit fuzzy and I need to have some things to help them, maybe to practice it a little bit more? Because I'm going to begin at that point to make a plan for small group instruction in my classroom, because I know that I'm going to start by looking at those standards, examining the work that my students are doing. One of the reasons I started by looking at those fluency activities that led into that lesson 1 is because a lot of times that fluency activity is that on-ramp for on grade level activity. It's the thing that connects students to what we're going to learn in that particular lesson. So I want to make sure they have those prerequisites so that they are successful. So now I've studied my standards, I'm ready. So I have an idea of what those expectations are for my students. And that's going to help be part of my guideposts with planning for small group activities. So my next step is to think about those small group activities, or as we like to refer to them as interventions. What are they going to look like? Now, one of the things we need to also keep in mind when we're planning for interventions with our students, it doesn't mean that it's only for students who are struggling. That means I'm planning for targeted, focused intervention based on the needs of my students. So some students may need enrichment. Some students may need something just to maintain, and some students may need some things to help fill in those pieces. In the math department, we like to talk about having 3 different types of interventions: lesson skill-based, standards-based, and diagnostic or interim-based assessments. Lesson skill-based are just exactly what they sound like. We use Eureka throughout all of our math classrooms in our district, so we know we have exit tickets each day at the end of each lesson. So that's that formative assessment check that lets you know where students are based on the content they've had in that lesson. A lot of people like to adopt the steps or the 3 pile approach, where you may have those students who have it, those students who almost have it, and then those students who maybe have some fuzziness or a lot of misconceptions. And so you sort those into, probably no more than those 3 groups, so that you can begin to think about, what am I going to do to support these 3 groups of students based on their needs? One of the things that we always want to remind you to do is to make sure when you're looking at that formative assessment data, make sure you meet with your students individually or when they're working with your group, and make sure that they understand why they're needing additional support or enrichment, meaning these are the things that you have as a strength. But these are some things that we want to work on so they know what the goal is in mind, so that they're goal oriented. When we think about our standards-based assessments, these will be based on like your end of module assessments that we have accessible through Illuminate, because those are all aligned to the standards. You can still use that 3-stack approach again when you want to divide your students into groups to determine to choose activities. Some people in the testing grades also like to use those achievement level descriptors, because it gives you an idea of proficiency on each of those standards and what it should look like. Again, you're going to share those assessment results with students so they can begin to think about, what are my strengths? What are some things I want to work on? And why I'm engaging in this specific activity to help me with that. So, for example, I pulled I will say this is the district results for our 3rd grade in the Module 4 assessment. So here you see of the almost 1,300 students who actually took this assessment and entered the data into the Illuminate database, that these are the results for those 5 standards that were assessed on this test. So when I look at this as a teacher, I see that, yes, there's one that really stands out, 3MD 5A, where students really had a lot of challenges with that content. But when I look at the other 3, they're only just a little bit above 50%. So if this were my grade 3 classroom, if this was not based on the entire district, I would want to have some activities for my students in teacher-led groups, as well as in their independent working groups that were correlated to these standards. And so as I move into Module 5, these are some things I'm going to have to help my students to build up their knowledge in these 4 areas to make sure that they are proficient. Also keeping in mind that all of these standards are major content standards. So this would be a way of looking at a standards-based intervention. The third type of intervention is diagnostic or interim based. And I know in our district, our interim based assessments are only accessible to our testing grades. So you would use your ANET assessment, which is what we use for our interim based assessments. And of course, these are also aligned to standards, but keeping in mind that we don't administer interims as often as we do our unit tests and our exit tickets. So they don't give you as many opportunities to actually, look at that work that you want to plan your small groups on. Again, you would communicate student results with students, but you want to make sure that you're using lots of things to make sure you plan for intervention with your students. So you're really going to find yourself using a combination of those lesson skill based, standards based, and some diagnostic interim based if you're in the testing grades. So, one of the things that we want to do is now that we've decided what type of interventions we can do, how am I going to go about providing the support or providing my students with the work they need to address those targeted skills? On the left hand of the screen, you see some common missteps, and then you see the recommendations. This is a document based on studies from Achieve the Core. And so one of the things that we find that there's some common things that we all fall prey to. I'm going to try to fill every single gap of everything that they don't know because I'm going to trace this back to first grade and the kids are in fourth grade. Well, that's fine and dandy, but we'll never get to fourth grade in a year's time if we go back that far. So the recommendations tell us how to do this based on best practices and what's actually going to help students make connections and really help them to bridge that gap and get to on grade level content. For the purpose of our session today, we're mainly going to highlight the one in yellow, which is tracing the learning progression, diagnose, and go back just enough. A lot of you have heard me talk about just in time support. That's what this is, where you're going to look at what is it I'm teaching in this module? What are the standards that are most closely aligned to that content? And that's what I'm going to work on if my students have some misconceptions there, because you're trying to make those connections. You're trying to bridge that gap. And I want to give them access to that on grade level content. That's our main thing we'll look at. However, we'll also look at the other two that are highlighted in blue, is focusing on the major work and considering the aspect, the rigor of the task that we choose for interventions. Now, when we say focus on major work, we don't mean that additional and supporting are not important, but we know that that's the bulk of the work that our students are engaging in. So I'm going to get the biggest bang for my buck if I help them fill in their misconceptions, their gaps, their fuzziness on the major work, because then I'm going to give them a lot more stability in their understanding and their learning. When we talk about considering the aspect of rigor, a lot of times when we think about interventions, especially when I remember things from my childhood, it's like you're going to practice these facts 200 times because, oh, you didn't get these right today. Well, that's fine and that's good, but that's really step by step, it's really procedural. You really have to look at the standard. If it's a conceptual understanding standard and the intervention I select is step by step and procedural, I'm still not going to be proficient in that standard because it doesn't match the type of standard that it is. So you really want to look at that standard, see if it's a conceptual understanding standard, make sure you're providing your students with that type of intervention. If it's application, you're going to build up to it, but you definitely want to make sure they have opportunities to do the work as it is aligned to the standard so that they can have success. And keeping in mind, one of the things that we want to do is use a 3-step approach to address those gaps in learning. So that's understand, diagnose, take action. We did understand when we looked at our standards and we were cognizant of what it is our students need to know and be able to do. We took a look at those prerequisites so we knew which standards were most closely aligned to that grade level content. Diagnose is when you looked at your data. Looked at your lesson skill-based data from exit tickets, looked at your end of module assessments, or looked at the results from your interim to see what is it that my students need to know. And for the purposes of this session, we're going to take action as it relates to small group needs. How am I going to plan for those targeted small group experiences for my students? So that takes us to our next step is to identify the students. I've decided what types of interventions I'm going to use, knowing that I'm probably going to use a combination of all three. But when I get ready to plan those activities, I have to identify who needs what. So let's go back to that end of module assessment we had for grade 3, module 4. So even though I know that those other three standards need to be looked at as well, let's look at just one of those standards, the one that the students had the most challenge with. So what I've done is I've gone into Illuminate and I've pulled a data report. And this is actually real data from one of our schools without any identifying features here. And so when you look at this matrix report, and I am looking at the standard space report, and I look at that standard where students had the most challenges, I'm looking at this class and I see that, well, this is actually an entire grade level at one school, that the entire grade level at this school, this was a challenge. Now, keep in mind, this was a constructive response, and we know that sometimes, especially for our third graders who are just beginning to see things that look like standardized tests, that could be an area of challenge. So you might think, oh my God, this was a problem for everybody. Let's reteach this for all. But there are a couple outliers. There are a couple students who actually answered the entire question correctly. So they got 100%. So those students need something different. I might look at these students, see which of those other standards are most closely aligned to them to see if they did well on those standards that were aligned to this standard and they're just ready for enrichment, or if they had a little fuzziness with a standard that was the next level or was a standard that came after this one, or you needed foundation from this standard to support the next. For my students who got 50% on this question, I want to take a look and see what did they do well on? What was the piece that was missing? And I'm going to plan intervention for them that focuses on those parts and those components that they need. Whereas maybe some of the other students, since they either didn't get any points or didn't attempt any, I may actually have some reteaching opportunities for those students around that standard. And so again, I would still place them in small groups so that I can provide them with the support that they need. But this is where I would actually look at that data for how students performed on that particular standard to plan what's going to happen for each of those students based on their needs. So if you are viewing this particular recording with your grade level or with all the math teachers at your school, or as a part of a vertical alignment with just math teachers, one or more from each grade level, this is where I would suggest that you pause and set your timer for 7 minutes and give yourself some time to actually examine those sample station activities. So I'm just going to click one of those resources. So this is one where you have each grade level and there are 2 standards and 2 activities for each grade level here. And then the other one is a scanned copy of some station activities that are camera ready to move into a classroom. And so one of the things we want you to do is to take like a brain break at this time if you are viewing it as a professional development with having engagement, having discussion. And so one of the things that I would suggest you look at when ask about what did you notice about the activities is to note that the activities that we've selected to share with you are activities that don't have a lot of directions for students. One, they have maybe minimal written information. They use very few materials and they don't take a lot of time to get together because we know that your time is limited, your time is precious. And so the more time that you have to actually analyze your data, look at your students, and spend time with your students is better and more beneficial for your students than it is preparing a station activity that has 5 cards to color, cut, glue, and a symbol and things of that nature. So if you are viewing this as a live session to have that engagement, this is where you would pause, set your timer for about 7 minutes, examine some of the station activities, and then come back for part two. So, keeping in mind with that understand, diagnose, take action, I want to make sure I call your attention to some of the resources you can use to help with that take action component. So, you recognize this as the scope and sequence document for third grade. And remember, we've been talking about module 4, and we see that those standards in question are green. So they're all major content standards. So one of the additional resources you have to help with that take action component is remember on your scope and sequence document, after you have your beginning information about each module, you have additional resources by standard, which are hyperlinked activities. So I went to 3MDC5A, that particular standard. And so you can see that there are a couple hyperlink Khan Academy activities. These might be some that would be good for your teacher-led table or even for independent use for some of your students to use in their independent station as well. And so you'll find different activities using 4 resources that we know are standards aligned and that support tier 1 curricula that you can utilize for your students. So now that we have all those pieces in place, now it's time for the fun part. Let's plan for what we're going to do in those independent workstations. So now we're thinking about what's happening, what are the students using when they are working independently. So there are 2 types of systems that we'll talk about that people typically use in elementary classrooms to keep their students engaged while they're working in the teacher-led groups. So one is a rotation system. And so this is where students may have a designated amount of time to complete each center or station before they move to the next. And so the amount of time that your students have in each station is determined by how much time you have for that small group center time in your classroom. So if you have the 90-minute block, you might choose to have a rotation where your students actually rotate 3 times during that intervention period. So every 10 minutes, they would go to a different activity. In this example, you see that the teacher table is one rotation. Our district intervention of Dreambox could be one, and then that independent learning might be that actual activity or game that you use to support what students need. So if you have a 75-minute block, you'll definitely have to make some adjustments to that because your kids won't be able to complete 3 different rotations. A lot of people who have a 75-minute block, instead, they choose to do a day-by-day rotation, where on day 1, maybe Latrinda goes to the teacher table. Day 2, I have Dreambox. Day 3, I get to go to my independent station. And then it starts over again after 3 days. And so students understand that rotation system in your classroom and how they're going to move from one activity to the next. keeping in mind the reason we talk about having a system is you want to make sure that all students have an opportunity to come to that teacher table, not just those students we've identified who have a lot of pieces or misconceptions. Even your students who need enrichment should come to your teacher table to engage in activities to support their learning as well. One of the other popular systems that a lot of people use, and I will say it's my system of choice, is a self-selected system where students are given a contract, a planning sheet, or some other type of accountability form where they have to record the activities they complete. And so, two popular ones that I've used a lot in my classrooms in the past have been math menus and choice boards. So a math menu, if you're easing into choice, is one of the easiest way to ease into that. And so what happens is just exactly what it is. It's a menu. I know when I did the math menu where I had meal, I had a picture of a kid eating a nice healthy dinner, with some turkey, vegetables, and a side. And then the choice is a dessert. So you can have a nice slice of cake or something, a picture there. And so the meal is the must do. So everything on that side of your menu are things that I must complete. My choices or dessert are the things that I can choose to do. So I know a lot of teachers have students, you have to complete everything on the meal side before you move to the dessert side. Some teachers say, oh, you can do 2 meal items and then you can move to a dessert. So you have to decide what works best for you in your classroom. But students understand the concept of I have to eat the healthy meal first before I can have the dessert. So a menu, they usually have no problem understanding that concept. Another self-selected system is the choice board. So this is one example of a choice board that's related to fractions. And so you have a series of activities where students can choose the activity they complete for that day, and then they move through all the activities on their board. I know some people like to do their choice board as a tic-tac-toe version where students only have to complete activities horizontally, vertically, or diagonally, and then they're finished. I usually did mine for blackout. If I put all the activities on there, I expected you to complete all the activities that were on the board. Whichever one you choose, even if you choose to have a rotation system, I would definitely suggest that you have a recording sheet. You want to have some type of accountability for your students as they're working because they need to know that this is important. This time is going to support their learning. It's directly connected to things that they need to reinforce, things that maybe they need to practice a little more, or things that are designed to take them a little bit further. So this is just one where kids are describing what they did and what date they did it, and maybe providing a little feedback to the teacher. Also, you'll notice in a lot of the sample activities that are linked on that document is that students actually have a recording sheet that go with those activities. And that's another piece of accountability as well. So now that we've identified when would you fit in your small group, we've talked about the different types of intervention, we talked about identifying students, and now we've talked about the different types of systems you might use for that small group. Now, there's the elephant in the room. What am I going to do as the teacher with my students when my students are engaged in these independent activities? So I have just a couple of suggestions for things that you can use for that. Remember, in our K-8 classrooms, we have access in our district to Zern. Zern on its own is a standalone Tier 1 curriculum. So it accompanies our Eureka Math curriculum or any Tier 1 curriculum very well. And so we have a lot of things that are available there. So what are some things that you could use for your teacher-led group that are there? Well, one, if your students are just working in grade level and they just need a little bit more practice, there's something called the teacher small group lesson. That's just a concept development lesson. So you might use that in your small group with your students so that you actually have a lesson that's scripted like Eureka Math, but it goes through all those components with them using just the math part, just the conceptual understanding component for your teacher-led lesson. But a lot of our students are using that small group teacher-led time to fill in some misunderstandings or misconceptions. And so this is where you would use that foundational guidance or intervention guidance that is accessible to us in Zern. So if you're looking here on the screen, you can see that I took a snippet from grade 4, mission 5, because we started out by looking at module 5 for grade 4. So for those students, when we were in lesson 1, 2, and 3, and we noticed that there were some misconceptions, there were some misunderstandings that students had, notice that Zern tells us that for those students who need that additional support, we're going to go to grade 3, Mission 5, Lesson 4. So for your teacher-led group, you would go to that teacher small group lesson for grade 3, Mission 5, Lesson 4, pull that concept development lesson and use that to teach your students to help them to support those pieces that are missing. Also keep in mind that you can also assign that digital lesson to your students as an independent activity that they might use in station rotations. Because in Zern, when they do foundational guidance, they don't do the full 30-minute Zern lesson. They only get the meat, just the instructional component. So you've got two pieces in Zern that you could use. That teacher-led piece for your group, and then the digital component for your students to use for their independent lesson. One of the other resources that we are lucky to have accessible to us is having the Accelerate tutoring resources from LDOE. Remember that those resources from LDOE are designed to align specifically to all of our Tier 1 resources. So if I'm going to grade 3, we'll go back to using my data from Illuminate. So I might go here to 3rd grade, and I would go to the module that we just had that assessment on, module 4. And so notice that these tutoring lessons are designed to provide students with what they need to accelerate them to the on-grade level content. So if I click this lesson, what's going to happen is that I have a complete lesson with slideshows that's scripted. It tells me all the pieces, all the components that I need. A lot of the materials are actually digital that you can use with your students. So they'll use the actual digital manipulative. So you don't have to worry if you don't have those. But if there's something for kids to touch and manipulate, they've got all the templates there for students to use. And so the lessons are here with all the animations for you to go through this lesson with your students in your teacher-led group. You may need to have 2 sessions to complete each lesson, but what I also like is each of these lessons ends with an exit ticket. So now I have a piece that I can use to assess student understanding from their work with me at the teacher-led table. And it's all aligned to my Tier 1 curricula. So it's just another resource I can use to help support my students in their learning. So now we've looked at all the pieces that you can use to put together to plan effectively for small group instruction. So as we begin to think about our next steps, one important thing is to have a self-assessment, to think about, am I ready for independent workstations in my classroom? Now, it doesn't mean you can say, no, I'm not ready, I don't want to go there. What it means is, do you have those structures in place? And so one of the things that is hyperlinked on that document is that planning document that I spoke to you about before, where it asks you a couple of questions about things you have in place, and that's where you can reach out for additional help. But there's also another piece that's here And this is a document that's titled Phasing In Independent Work. And so what happens is there are 5 phases or steps that you can use if you haven't been using this in your classroom in the past. So these are 5 steps you can use to slowly get your students ready for those steps. So it starts with, how do you get them to practice? How do they learn what to do when they have to do something independently and I'm working at a table with other students, because you want them to understand that this is a time when the students who are at the teacher-led group need your full attention. So this is a good resource or tool to use to help you to actually phase that in. So help you to put those structures in place in your classroom so that your students can manage going through those things. One of the other suggestions, select the format or protocol that works well for your classroom. Is it going to be rotations? Is it going to be take to your seat stations, or things that they actually get up and go to a table or a shelf or an area to pick up? Think about if you want to use a self-selected system. So you have to find the protocol that works best for you and your students. And then for the next step is to go to an upcoming module or topic and plan just a few activities, maybe 4 activities for small group or independent work time in your classroom, and start slowly and start there to begin to plan. You may find some of those sample activities that are hyperlinked there are things that you're working on in your classroom that will work well with you and your students. One of my other suggestions is to collaborate with others on your grade level. So what if you're departmentalized at your school and you're the only 4th grade teacher? Well, find other 4th grade teachers in this district. That's one of the benefits of being in a large district where we're all using the same curriculum. You are definitely customizing it to meet your needs and the needs of your students, but we know that we're teaching the same curriculum. So you're about on the same thing at the same time. Find a group of collaborators so you can work with each other. I know when I first started teaching, one of the things that I benefited from a lot is that I had 2 buddies who taught the same grade level as me. And so we would get together whenever it was time to start a new unit, and we would work together, share activities, and bring station activities that we could all use in our classroom. So those are your next steps. And so as we wrap up today's presentation, I definitely want to thank you for taking the time to engage in this presentation on planning effectively for small group instruction. I definitely encourage you to use that planning document to reach out and tell us specifically what are some things that you might need for support, things you might need that you have more additional questions about, and things of that nature. And so please enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again for reaching out, and do utilize our email addresses just to provide some feedback, ask questions, or just to say, hey, come visit and see what a wonderful job my students are doing with these station rotations. So thank you so much, and have a great time with your students and small group instruction.